Hi, it's Fook, and I'm back with another portfolio visualizer tutorial. This time I'm going to dive a little bit in depth with the Monte Carlo simulation. So the Monte Carlo simulation can be found on the lower left of the home screen, and it's this link right here. So we're going to click in that to go into it. And as we go through the tutorial, I'm actually going to use a concept, a risk parity allocation concept that I've developed to kind of illustrate how you would use the Monte Carlo simulation. So to start off, you can read all of the details up here if you like. I'm not going to do that. I will let you do that on your own time, but let's get right into it. So I've developed a risk parity portfolio allocation that I'm going to be shifting all of my assets into as I get closer and closer to pulling the trigger on my fat fire journey. And I'd use this to kind of figure out what that allocation should be. And I'm going to kind of go through with you. And hopefully as I go through it, you'll also pick up some tips on how the Monte Carlo simulation works. So the first thing is you have to decide if you're going to use asset classes or if you're going to use specific ticker symbols. So if you're using asset classes, down here below where you're building the portfolio, you can select from the usual suspects, U.S. equities, either total stock market, large cap growth, whatever you may want. So these are classes of assets that you can include, or you can do tickers. In my case, I'm going to use specific ticker symbols because that's how I've built the portfolio. And what I want to do is I want to test to see how the portfolio would do in a relatively long drawdown period, because we are talking about the FIRE movement after all. So let's assume that we start off with an initial amount of $4 million. So I'll go ahead and put that in for the initial amount. And we're going to withdraw a fixed amount periodically. But if you click the drop down here, you can change it to whatever you want. Now, we're doing a drawdown example, but you can also use the Monte Carlo to see how your portfolio would grow and accumulate if you were to start off with something and then adding, a fixed amount periodically. But you can go through this and play with the different options. But for now, we're going to withdraw a fixed amount periodically. The amount we're going to withdraw is $140,000 a year. This works out to be 3.5% of the portfolio. So if you watch my Fat Fire spend portfolio or video, I talk about using a 3.5% safe withdrawal rate only because the retirement drawdown period is going to be quite long. It's not going to be the normal 25, 30 years of retirement. It's going to be something like 45, 50 years, at least in my case. In some cases in the FIRE movement, you have people retiring in their 30s where they can have, 55, 60 years of retirement ahead of them. That won't be me. I'm way past that. I'll still retire early, but I won't have that long of a retirement. We can adjust for inflation, and the default is yes, so we'll leave that alone. Withdrawal frequency is annually, but again, you can do it on a quarterly basis or monthly as you prefer. I'm going to leave it annual for now. And simulation period, I'm going to go to 45 years. And the rest of this we'll leave alone for now. We'll go and revisit some of these, but let's get down to the portfolio and what assets we're going to add to it. So keep in mind that we're adding tickers and not classes. But as before, if you click on this little gear icon here, there are some pre-built portfolios in here under the lazy portfolio that you can use and see how they perform. So for example, there's Harry Brown's permanent portfolio. There's Ray Dalio's all seasons or all weather portfolio. You got Rick Ferry Core 4, so on and so forth. If you were to click on one of these lazy portfolios, it'll fill in the right symbols and then gives you the specific allocation. But like I said, we're not going to do that. We're going to use the allocation that I came up with, which is 40% large cap stocks. And for large caps, I'm using the NASDAQ 100, so that's QQQ, and that's 40%. For the next portion of stocks, we're using small cap value, and I'm using the Vanguard VBR, and we'll put 10% in that. On the bond side, we're going to use long-term treasuries as represented by TLT, and I have a 30% allocation there. It's quite large, but it's going to work for now, and I'll get into this maybe in this video, maybe in another video. We'll see where this goes. The next asset is gold, and GLD is fine. We'll put 10% on there. And as we fill this in, you'll see that the total is adding up. And when you get to 100, you can run your simulation. The last one I'm going to do is a REIT. And this REIT happens to be a stock by itself. It's not a fund. It's just O, which is Realty Income Core. And we'll put the last 10% there as well. Once we have 100 in the total, we can click Run Simulation and see what happens over 40 years. So this simulation is going to represent 10,000 different runs with our initial starting condition. And what I usually focus on when I do the Monte Carlo simulation is the 50 percentile. That's kind of the middle of the result set and should be the most representative of what you can expect to see. The 90 percentile is kind of like the best case scenario. And on the opposite end of the spectrum is the 10 percentile, which is the worst case scenario. So we can see that if we were to start out with these initial conditions and have the portfolio run for 45 years, in the best case, we'll end up with over $1 billion, right? But in the most likely scenario, we're going to end up with around 450 million. Still great. What this is telling me is that maybe my safe withdrawal rate is too low. Now, I was worried and used a lower safe withdrawal rate just because of how long the drawdown is. But this is one of the things that is really attractive to me about this specific allocation and how I set it up. You can see that the drawdown in the most likely scenario is around 22%. When I had done this as a back test, that's what it was coming in, roughly 22% in terms of max drawdown. Is this the lowest drawdown you can have? No, because you can do, say, the golden butterfly portfolio and get, something in the 10% range for drawdown. But still, I think that this allocation specifically gives you a nice rate of return, which you can see here is right around 10%, and a relatively low drawdown. So it's a really balanced approach to return versus drawdown. So that's why I kind of like it. As we scroll down here, we see the different lines and where they're going to end up with, right? So all the portfolios make it over 45 years. Normally when you're running this, you're going to see another chart down here that tells you the success rate of the portfolio. And it's kind of pointless for this run of it because everything survives and survives by a big margin. Now, every time you click this button, it's going to run another 10,000 runs of the Monte Carlo simulation. And you'll get slightly different results, but for the most part, you'll end up within these magnitudes, right? So in the best case, you're going to be at $1 billion. In the 50 percentile, you're going to be at around 450 million. And in the worst case, you're going to end up with about 180, 182, something like that. But every time I click this button, it'll rerun another 10,000 runs of it. And you'll get slightly different results. So you can see here that the 10 percentile went up by about 1 million. So it was 181. This went up as well, and so did this. But on rough order of magnitude, you're going to see kind of similar results, no matter how many times you click that button, until you make some changes. All right, so this is the basic of the Monte Carlo simulation. Now I'm going to go back up to the initial assumptions and make some tweaks. One of the things I love about Portfolio Visualizer and its Monte Carlo simulation is this part right here, sequence of return risk. Because as you know, in retirement, the biggest risk you have is the sequence of returns you're going to face as soon as you start withdrawing funds. If you were to face a lot of down years in the beginning, that's where you can run a high risk of running out of money. And this particular section allows you to model that. So by default, there's no adjustments in the simulation for sequence of return risk, but we can set the portfolio to select the number of worst years to come first in the sequence of returns and see how that affects our result. So it goes from no adjustment all the way up to taking the worst 10 years at the very beginning of the run, and that's what we're going to do. So we'll select the worst 10 years first and go down here and click Run Simulation just to see what happens. And if you were to face the worst 10 years of returns at the very beginning of this 45-year period, so that's almost a quarter of the time, because it's 10 is almost 1/4 of 45, you can see that in the worst case, you will run out of money, right? But in all the other scenarios, you're going to do just fine. And in the most likely scenario, you'll still end up with a lot more money than you started with if we were to keep that withdrawal rate at 3.5%. If I were to scroll down here, now you can see that chart that I was mentioning that didn't show up before, which is the portfolio success rate, right? So even with that 10 percentile failing, it's reporting that we're going to get about an 89% success rate over 45 years for this allocation, which I think is pretty phenomenal. If we go up to the chart where it shows the different lines, you can actually see how long your money would last at the 10 percentile. Okay, so we'll just go back slowly here, and we can see that even in the worst case, this allocation is going to last between 35 and 36 years, right? And that's facing the 10 worst years of returns at the very beginning. It's almost the worst case that you can do, and combined with the worst outcome from the simulation, and it's still going to last you 35 years. Now, hopefully what you do is that you become very flexible and adjust your withdrawals if you were seeing a bunch of, down years at the very beginning, right? So if we were to see that, prudence would tell us to go ahead and reduce our withdrawal rate, right? And you can see what happens here, because if we start at 4 million in year 0, if we had a bad year, everything's going down in year 1. If we have another bad year, it goes down again, and it keeps going down. But at some point after the 10th year, it'll start to recover, right? So that's one of the great things you can do with this simulation and kind of play around. Now, if I were to drop this sequence of return risk from taking the 10 worst years first down to, like, say, 7, we can rerun this and see what happens. And now even our 10th percentile is going to survive, okay? Our portfolio success rate drops down from 100% ever so slightly. It's still 97.5% successful, which is just great for this allocation. Just to show you how good this allocation is, we can go ahead and tweak this by picking some other, lazy portfolio. So let's say that we were to use Harry Brown's permanent portfolio. Run the simulation. We can see that Harry Brown also survives over 7 years of worst returns. But you can see in the most likely scenario that the rate of return is a lot less, and the worst, max drawdown is also a lot worse than what we had previously. If we were to switch to, say, Ray Dalio, all season, run that, okay, it too survives, right? But again, faces very similar, drawdown, a little bit higher return. And you can do this with all of the other portfolio and see what happens. So here's Paul Merriman's ultimate buy and hold. Okay. And we can actually see that this one is actually pretty bad because none of the outcomes survive, right? Not in the best case, and certainly not in the worst case, especially if we were to face 7 years of bad returns at the beginning. So I would actually say that this ultimate buy and hold portfolio is not that ultimate. No offense to Paul Merriman and fund advice. But like I said, you can go and play around with this, Rick Ferry's Core 4, see what happens, and just see what you face. Same thing with the Core 4. None of the situations survive. And you can see that it runs out of money pretty quickly in almost all cases except the very best, right? So that's one of the things that I love to play around with here. I think one of the things that I had checked was to look at the golden butterfly portfolio from portfolio charts. So I'm going to go here and see what the allocation is, and then we can model that. So here's the golden butterfly, and it looks like it's basically total stocks, small cap, long-term bonds, short-term bonds, and then gold. So we can do that. Total stock market is, this is fine. We can do long-term bonds. Let me see if I can find a long-term bond here. We'll just do TLT again. Short-term bonds, we'll do SHI, gold, and then small cap. And we'll use that VBR. Okay. And on this one, it's 20, 20, 20, and 20. All right. Let's run this. So again, the golden butterfly survives. It gets pretty decent rate of return. It's similar to Ray Dalio's all-season portfolio. Max drawdown is still pretty bad with the golden butterfly. Normally, the golden butterfly has a very low drawdown. Right here, 11% at the deepest. But when we do the Monte Carlo simulation, it's showing a much higher max drawdown. Okay, so this is why I like the allocation that I had selected, which was like QQQ, TOT, use O, gold. All right, so let me fix that back to where we had it. All of these are 10. And then I'll show you a little, couple more tips on the Monte Carlo simulation, and then we'll call it a day. So we're back to 100. I'm going to set this worst 7 years to no adjustments again, and we'll rerun. So we should get similar to what we had before, around 180 million in the worst case, 450 in the most likely case, and $1 billion in the best case. All right. At the very top here in the simulation result, you'll see that there are a couple of tabs, right? We can click on histogram and see where the results fall in. So most of the results are falling in these three histograms here, 3 buckets. And in terms of max drawdowns, most of them are falling, in this range right here, 18 to 21. Okay. You can go to expected returns and see what happens over the different percentiles over the course of the portfolio's life, and the return and loss probabilities. Simulated assets gives you the expected annual return for the different investments as well as their volatility. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a screenshot of this because we're going to make use of this. All right. And then back to simulation summary. Next thing I want to show you is the simulation model, right? By default, it uses historical returns, which is fine. We can also use forecasted returns. And if you want to know what the difference is, not forecasted, statistical returns. If you want to know what the difference is for the different models, you can read about it up here. So statistical returns is just simulating future returns based on the mean, volatility, and correlation of the portfolio, right? So we were to change it from historical to statistical. It doesn't actually change the result all that much. So if I were to run the simulation, you can see that it's roughly the same. Still $1 billion, still about 400 million, and then 134 on the worst end. So down below here, it drops a little bit, but again, I wouldn't call it statistically very different. Okay. The next one is that historic or the forecasted return. So this is where you get to put in some mean returns, and then using the standard deviation, it'll figure out the rest. So let me see if I can pull that picture back up. All right, so the expected return for QQQ is 16.5. Long-term bonds is 8, 14.3 for O, 10.8 for gold, and 10.16 for small caps. So let's put that in. 16.5. This was 8. This was 10.8 if I recall. This was, I don't remember. Actually, I was totally wrong. 14.3 and then 10.8. And I think this is 10.1, maybe 10.16. Yeah, 10.16. But that's fine. We'll leave it at that, and then we'll go ahead and run the simulation. And when we do, we come up with something that was very similar to what it was before, okay, in rough order of magnitude. Again, we can select, say, the worst 7 years and see what happens. Okay, all the portfolios survive. That's great. All right, the last thing we're going to do is we're going to tweak the mean return, because when I had posted this allocation, and it's the same concerns that I have, was that the allocation of long-term treasury is too high given the environment that we are in, right? That's a very common criticism of this specific allocation, and it's something that I worry about as well. You know, do I really want 30% of long-term U.S. treasuries, especially in a low-rate environment where rates are more likely to go up than not? And we all know what happens when interest rates go up on long-term bonds, right? These are really long duration that are really sensitive to interest rate movements, and it's a fair criticism. So I think that, you know, one thing that we can do is to adjust the returns for just the long-term bonds. Okay, so instead of getting a mean return of 8%, I'm going to chop it off by a quarter and call it 6. I think this is a fair adjustment to overcome the criticism of such a large allocation to bonds over 45 years. If rates were to go up in the short term, we are going to suffer on our long-term bond holdings, right? But hopefully, you know, gold or real estate or something else is going to compensate. And as we rebalance annually in the portfolio, it should smooth that out. And hopefully, over the 45 years, in the latter years especially, the long-term bonds are going to do fine. But I think making the adjustment from 8 to 6% is a reasonable adjustment. I'm not very comfortable going much lower than that. I think this is more than enough to compensate for the environment that we're in. So let's leave everything else alone and call this 6 and just run it and see what happens. And again, we're keeping the worst 7 years first. Okay. So when we do that, what happens is that the 10th percentile, the worst outcome, didn't make it. Okay, whereas before it did. We can actually go down and see how long it lasts. Keep going backwards. Here we go. 30 years it would last, and even in the worst of cases. Okay, I don't think that's very likely, and I would still be very comfortable with this, because in the other scenarios, in the other percentiles, especially the 50th percentile, we would still come out way ahead, right? And the overall success rate of portfolio only drops down to 85.7%, roughly 86%, which I still think is pretty darn good. So bottom line is that I'm very comfortable with this allocation. Maybe this specific component doesn't do well in the next, call it 5 years. But after that, it should start to recover, right? But over the long haul, we can see that even with facing 7 years of the worst returns at the very beginning, it still does remarkably well, even when I've made this adjustment. And like I said, if I don't make the adjustment, everything survives. So it's great. The other thing that you can do with this tool right here, and it doesn't really make a difference for me, but we can do after-tax returns, right? If we're withdrawing that much, we're probably going to be in the 24% bracket. State of California, I'm going to be in like the 9% bracket. Dividends and capital gains we'll put at 15. So we can fill that in and run the simulation, and it will adjust our returns accordingly. Here we go. So a lot less, right, with the tax factored in, okay? And again, this is using just the 8% return, which is the expected return, so we can switch back to historical, and just adjusting it for taxes, okay? We still come out way ahead in all scenarios. So if you were to start out with something like this as a single person, even with the high estate tax exemption, you would still face some estate tax on the worst end, and on the very high end, post-tax and everything. And of course, I have Roth funds and all of that as a part of the portfolio, so I won't face these tax rates across the entire portfolio, but that's what the simulation is showing. If you want, you can tweak the tax rates accordingly to account for some portion of your portfolio being in a Roth allocation, and see how it affects you. But basically, if you were to start out with this allocation over 45 years, you would end up with a huge gift to your heirs. But in any case, that is the in-depth run-through of the Monte Carlo simulation on Portfolio Visualizer, or as much as I want to go in depth so I don't bore the hell out of you. But play around with this. I think it's one of the best Monte Carlo simulation tool that's available for free out there. And if you find this useful or enjoy it, please give me a thumbs up. I really appreciate it. Thanks for checking out my videos. Later.